And here we enter Greyfriars Kirk, or church. Here are a list of some of the important people in this cemetery. The only one that we actually might have recognized, I think, but didn't, was James Hutton down below, geologist. She said he was the first person to discourse intelligently on landforms. Perhaps, if that's true, because this area has been dominated by tectonic plate action, volcanoes, and glacial action. One can only imagine what the origin and purpose of this was. So much of the history of the church has been to scare the bejesus out of people that this may be a direct allusion to that or something more subtle. One of the things our guide yesterday pointed out was that while these grave sites and their stones look quite prim and proper, standing upright, etc., etc., in fact, because this was a walled-in town and there was only so much space, very much like the Jews in, I think it was Krakow and also perhaps Warsaw, who were forced there to confine all their activities to their prescribed area of the town. There are layer upon layer upon layer of people buried under these stones and where there are no stones. In fact, probably right where I'm standing also. But I've noticed in many of the churches that I looked at when traveling across the northern England that the stones often referred to 2 or 3 or more people, and the space was only adequate for one. So I can only presume that perhaps they're also there stacked. This is interesting, and she tested us to see if we could begin to imagine what it was for. What it is, I'll give you the background first. Back in the day, when medicine was evolving and understanding the human body for medical schools was essential, medical schools would pay considerable amounts of money for bodies depending upon the condition. And it was discovered by some that, and some did it criminally, either by taking bodies in and getting money or by stealing the bodies, they could make considerable amounts of money. She pointed out that it was something like a pound was worth something like 200 what are those little things, pences, and that a beer was a pence in those days. So you could see what a grand time you could have for relatively little profit gain. But anyway, the purpose of these things was to protect the buried from the grave robbers. This one happens to have, although many did not, the inscription presumably of who's buried here. And I asked her, but she said there's no evidence from excavation, which is curious to me, that in theory, in spite of the fact that this seems to be ending right here, it goes down 6 feet and has a base similar to it, so that you were literally locked into a cage. Also, it was possible that you would rent one of these, your heirs would rent one of these for a period of at least 2 weeks, if not longer, because it took 2 weeks for the bodies to degenerate to a point where the medical schools wouldn't pay for it. And then you would be moved to your permanent grave site and interred in some modicum of safety. This is the same thing, only built out of block stone. So in theory, you had a rent-a-cage for the deceased. Now, if you were wealthy enough, you had a solution, a rather grand one. You created your own mausoleum, if you will, and it's embedded, there are several, in the church's walls, exterior grounds walls, and that gave you a high level of protection. Presumably it was hard to break into them. And this is the school that some people think was Rowling's motivation for Hogwarts, or whatever it is in Harry Potter, but it's alleged it's not. But that is the school that the man I referred to, Herrick, earlier, had built at considerable amounts of money for those who were orphaned. But now, over many variations of use, it's now a very wealthy school, or for the wealthy, with a few token orphans thrown in. Now this is interesting because here's a reference to Flodden Wall. Presumably this wall that goes by here was both the city wall and the wall for this church. Here a curious headstone in the form of a table. Whether it once was inside that building, which has been disassembled to that degree, I don't know. Who did the people who built this think would care? And for how long? That is our guide from yesterday, Izzy, from Chicago. I suppose it's a way for a man and his family to say, once we were powerful. But for me it says, yes, but you are dust, as I will be. And here it looks like the wall goes on, and it looks like there might have been a series of buildings off to the left here. But what this complex was and how it related to the Kirk, I don't know. Here another family plot, empty now, stripped of whatever it might have had. But on the outside, these warnings. The irony of these places is, magnificent as they might have once been, now seemingly stripped of everything they had, including their roofs and whatever was inside, have suffered a worse fate than the least of the tombstones that we see here. Although you have to recognize that underneath here are layers and layers of people who lost their recognition forever a long time ago. That's impressive. I wonder if he truly lies and stayed inside that box. One can imagine that the man who lies here, if he was the most successful origin of this family's fame, how he must have labored over his crest, thinking how important each detail it was and how history would reflect upon it. And yet here we see how history has reflected upon it. The plaques to he and his loved ones. The red stone that he used to try to distinguish his little house of burial from the rest. The statue of Greyfriar Robbie and the traditions and stories he's inspired.